The true story of the Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, a war born from expansion in the mid-1800s. The United States was exploding westward, fueled by a belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were divinely destined to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Political leaders set their sights on the vast northern territories of Mexico, Texas, California, New Mexico, and more at the same time. Mexico was still reeling from independence won in 1821, facing deep internal divisions, indigenous uprisings, and political instability. The U.S., by contrast, was rapidly industrializing and militarizing. Tensions between the two neighbors erupted into open war in 1846, but the seeds had been planted long before. Roots of a war, Texas, Mexico, and the border dispute that sparked a nation's expansion. 1820 to 1846 **1. Introduction. Seeds of a border war by the early 19th century. The vast lands of North America west of the Mississippi remained largely unsettled by European powers. Spain had once claimed much of it, but after Mexico gained independence in 1821, it inherited an enormous northern frontier stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. Among these lands was Texas, a region with fertile soil, a sparse population, and tremendous economic potential. Yet for all its promise, Texas was also a land of vulnerability. Mexico lacked the resources to control it effectively, and indigenous resistance persisted. To secure the region, the Mexican government made a fateful decision. It invited settlers from the United States' former enemies to come and populate Texas. What began as a mutually beneficial arrangement would spiral, within 2 decades, into a full-scale war that would redraw the map of North America. This is the story of how cultural conflict, political miscalculation, slavery, and territorial ambition turned Texas into a flashpoint of war, a war that would ultimately engulf Mexico and the United States between 1846 and 1848. Mexico's northern frontier and the invitation to settle Texas when Mexico won its independence. From Spain in 1821, it inherited a vast northern frontier that was largely underpopulated and underdefended. Texas, then part of the Mexican state of Coahuila, Texas was home to only a few thousand Mexican settlers, Tejanos, scattered missions, and hostile Comanche and Apache groups. To protect this region and encourage development, Mexico implemented a colonization policy. It offered large tracts of land to empresarios, land agents who would bring in settlers, mostly from the United States. One of the most notable was Stephen F. Austin, who brought hundreds of Anglo-American families to Texas starting in the 1820s. These settlers were expected to become Mexican citizens, adopt Catholicism, and obey Mexican law. At first, the experiment worked. The Anglo population grew rapidly, boosting the local economy and giving Mexico a stronger grip on the region. But the Mexican government failed to consider how deeply American settlers would cling to their language, customs, and especially their commitment to slavery. 3. Rising tensions between settlers and Mexican authorities as the Anglo-American population surged, reaching over 20,000. By the early 1830s, tensions began to simmer. Many settlers refused to learn Spanish, disregarded Mexican laws, and continued practicing Protestant faiths instead of converting to Catholicism. Even more troubling to Mexican officials was the settlers' dependence on slavery. While Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, the Anglo settlers in Texas largely ignored the law. Many were from the American South and brought enslaved African Americans with them to cultivate cotton and sugar. Mexico's efforts to enforce its authority, including tax collection, military posts, and anti-slavery laws, were met with stiff resistance. Mexican officials were increasingly viewed as foreign occupiers by settlers who still identified as Americans. 4. Slavery, language, and religion. Clashing cultures' cultural differences deepened the divide. Settlers resented having to file legal documents in Spanish. They distrusted Catholic priests. They traded freely with the United States, defying Mexican tariffs and regulations. Meanwhile, Tejano residents, Mexican Texans, found themselves caught between two worlds. Many supported economic development and welcomed settlers, but others feared they were losing control over their land, politics, and culture. The conflict was no longer just about law and order. It had become a clash of civilizations. One Anglo-Protestant, English-speaking, slaveholding; the other Catholic, Spanish-speaking, and anti-slavery. It was a conflict that would only escalate. *5. The spark: Santa Anna's centralism and Texan resistance in the early 1830s. The political instability of post-independence Mexico reached a boiling point. The young republic was deeply divided between Federalists, who favored decentralized government and strong states' rights, and Centralists, who sought to concentrate power in Mexico City. In 1833, General Antonio López de Santa Anna was elected President of Mexico. He initially positioned himself as a Federalist, but he soon consolidated power and abolished the Constitution of 1824, centralizing authority and dissolving state legislatures. His dictatorship alienated Mexicans across the country and Texans. Most of all, in Texas, the move to centralism was seen not only as a betrayal of liberty, but as a direct threat to local autonomy, property rights, and the way of life settlers had developed. Tensions flared further when Santa Anna sent military forces into Texas to enforce new laws and subdue dissent. The spark ignited in 1835 when Mexican troops attempted to seize a small cannon from the town of Gonzales. The locals resisted, raising an infamous banner that read, "Come and take it." This defiance was not merely symbolic. It marked the beginning of an organized rebellion. Across Texas, Anglo settlers and some Tejanos rose in open revolt. They formed militias, seized local garrisons, and declared that their resistance was in defense of the Constitution of 1824, even though many were already contemplating full independence. Santa Anna, enraged, prepared to march north with a large army. What followed was one of the most dramatic and mythologized revolutions in North American history. Point 6. The Texas Revolution, 1835 to 1836. The Siege of Bayard. October-December 1835, the opening months of the Revolution, saw a series of local victories for the Texian rebels. In the town of Bayard, modern-day San Antonio, Texians laid siege to a Mexican garrison under General Martin Perfecto to cause Santa Anna's brother. The siege dragged on for weeks, culminating in a daring assault in December 1835. After intense house-to-house combat, Cos surrendered and withdrew his forces. The Texians believed they had won Texas, but the war was far from over. The Alamo, symbol of defiance. February-March 1836. In March 1836, Santa Anna's main army, over 6,000 strong, marched into Texas. His goal was total suppression of the rebellion. One of his first targets, a small mission-turned fortress in San Antonio, known as the Alamo. Roughly 180 Texian defenders, including famed frontiersmen James Bowie, William B. Travis, and Davy Crockett, fortified themselves inside the Alamo. For 13 days, Mexican forces besieged the fort. On the morning of March 6, 1836, Santa Anna launched a final assault. The Texians were overrun. All defenders were killed. Santa Anna spared few prisoners. The brutality of the Alamo, combined with the defenders' courage, became a rallying cry. For Texian forces, remember the Alamo. Goliad Massacre, March 27, 1836, shortly after the fall of the Alamo. Another tragedy struck at Goliad, where Colonel James Fannin and his 300-man force had surrendered to Superior. Mexican forces under General Urrea. Despite assurances of humane treatment, Santa Anna ordered their execution. On March 27, Mexican troops marched the prisoners out in groups and gunned them down. The Goliad Massacre, like the Alamo, enraged the Texian public and solidified opposition. Resistance turned into a fight for vengeance. Battle of San Jacinto. The stunning Texan victory, April 21, 1836. The final and decisive battle came just weeks later. General Sam Houston, leading the main Texian army, lured Santa Anna's forces eastward, near the San Jacinto River. On April 21, during the Mexican army's afternoon siesta, Houston launched a surprise attack. It lasted just 18 minutes. The Texians routed the Mexican camp, killing over 600 soldiers and capturing hundreds, including Santa Anna himself, who was found the next day hiding in civilian clothes. Faced with death, Santa Anna agreed to recognize Texas independence, though the Mexican government later repudiated the agreement. Texas was now de facto independent. The Republic of Texas was born, and with it, new complications for the future of the continent. Asterisk. 7. The Republic of Texas, an unrecognized nation in the spring of 1836. After defeating Santa Anna's forces at the Battle of San Jacinto, the victorious Texan rebels declared independence. The new nation, calling itself the Republic of Texas, drafted a constitution and appointed Sam Houston as its first president. But although it operated as an independent country, recognition on the world stage proved elusive, and its long-term survival remained in question. Diplomatic limbo, while the United States recognized Texas within months. Mexico refused to accept the loss of its northern province, viewing the Republic as a rebellious territory that would eventually be reintegrated. Mexico's position was bolstered by many European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, which withheld formal recognition out of concern for destabilizing diplomatic relations with Mexico. However, this did not prevent the Republic of Texas from sending envoys to London and Paris in search of trade agreements and legitimacy. By the early 1840s, Britain and France would grant limited recognition and establish consulates, but even then, they treaded carefully. These powers hoped to influence Texas toward remaining independent rather than being absorbed into the rapidly expanding United States border problems. One of the greatest issues plaguing the fledgling Republic was the uncertain border with Mexico. Texans claimed the Rio Grande as their southern and western boundary, far beyond the traditionally accepted Mexican provincial boundary at the Nueces River. However, Mexico refused to recognize the Rio Grande claim, which placed Texas in an uneasy military posture. Skirmishes along the disputed frontier would continue throughout the Republic's existence. Economic struggles and dependence financially. The Republic was in crisis. War debts from the Revolution had piled up. The economy, reliant on agriculture and cotton exports, suffered from instability and lack of international credit. The Texan dollar, known as the redback, collapsed in value. As time passed, many Texans began to doubt their long-term viability as an independent nation. They depended on American settlers and trade, and fears of Mexican reconquest only deepened the urgency to find a permanent solution, often pointing to annexation by the United States. Slavery and sectional fears. The Republic of Texas legalized slavery and welcomed enslavers, making it a magnet for settlers from the U.S. South. This fact created sharp political divisions in the United States, particularly among Northern abolitionists, who were wary of adding another slave state to the Union. Thus, Texas independence became deeply entangled not only in U.S.-Mexico relations, but in the growing sectional crisis within the United States itself. Point 8. The annexation debate in the U.S. While Texas sought admission into the Union almost from the moment it declared independence, the U.S. government hesitated. The annexation debate raged in Congress. The press, and among the American public pitting expansionists and slaveholders against Northern abolitionists and advocates of peace with Mexico. Manifest destiny versus diplomacist supporters of annexation. Particularly Southern Democrats framed Texas as the next logical step in manifest destiny. The belief that the United States was divinely destined to expand from coast to coast. They argued that the U.S. should fulfill its natural right to control the continent, with Texas being key to that goal. Opponents countered with a different concern. War with Mexico. U.S. diplomats warned that annexing Texas would be seen by Mexico as an act of aggression. Mexico had already issued repeated threats that it would treat annexation as a declaration of war. The slavery question. The bigger and more explosive issue was slavery. Texas was a slaveholding republic, and its entry into the Union threatened to tip the delicate balance between free and slave states in Congress. Northern abolitionists, including prominent figures like John Quincy Adams, warned that annexation was part of a conspiracy to expand slavery and entrench Southern political power. Anti-slavery Whigs rallied against the idea, especially in states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, where resistance to the slave power was gaining steam. Even some moderate Northerners, who were not abolitionists per se, were alarmed at the prospect of rapid expansion without careful consideration of its consequences. Presidential politics. Tyler and Polka President John Tyler, an independent Southerner, surprised many by making Texas annexation the central issue of his presidency. In 1844, Tyler negotiated a treaty of annexation with Texas, but it was rejected by the Senate in June 1844 due to opposition from Northern senators. Then came the election of 1844, a turning point in American history. Democrat James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist, ran on a platform of annexing both Texas and Oregon. He narrowly defeated the Whig candidate, Henry Clay, who was forced to take an ambiguous stance on the issue and lost support in key states. Polk's election was interpreted as a mandate for expansion, and lame duck President Tyler, acting quickly before Polk took office, orchestrated a joint resolution of Congress in early 1845 to approve annexation, bypassing the need for a treaty. Annexation becomes reality in March 1845. The U.S. formally offered Texas admission into the Union. In July, the Texan Congress voted overwhelmingly in favor, and by December 29, 1845, Texas officially became the 28th state. Mexico reacted with fury, breaking off diplomatic relations with the United States. The two nations stood on the brink of war. Mexican troops gathered in the northern provinces, and U.S. troops under General Zachary. Taylor moved into the disputed territory between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers. The question was no longer if war would come but when. Border lines and battle lines. Nueces Strip tensions. The annexation of Texas in 1845 did not merely provoke diplomatic outrage in Mexico. It ignited a geopolitical firestorm over an ambiguous and contested frontier. The Nueces Strip, a swath of land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. This strip became a flashpoint that would draw the United States and Mexico ever closer to open war. The disputed zone. When Texas declared independence in 1836, it claimed the Rio Grande as its southern boundary, a line that extended deep into Mexican territory. However, Mexico had never recognized the independence of Texas, let alone its expansive territorial claims. In Mexico's eyes, the Nueces River, over 150 miles to the northeast, remained the true boundary. This created a volatile buffer zone, sparsely populated, legally ambiguous, and militarily unprotected. Known as the Nueces Strip, this region became a symbol of contested sovereignty. Texas Rangers and settlers began to push deeper into the strip. Mexican cavalry patrolled from the south, occasionally skirmishing with armed Texans. Banditry. Raiding and confusion reigned in the lawless middle ground. A powder keg waiting for a spark president, James K. Polk, a zealous advocate of manifest destiny, made it clear that he intended to enforce Texas' Rio Grande claim, despite Mexico's objections. In his first address to Congress, Polk emphasized that Texas had become a U.S. state with her rightful boundaries. This included the disputed Nueces Strip. Polk dispatched General Zachary Taylor and approximately 3,500 troops to Corpus Christi, a settlement on the Gulf Coast just north of the Rio Grande. Taylor's mission was publicly described as defensive, but privately, Polk intended it as a demonstration of American resolve. Polk was not merely preparing for war, he was preparing to provoke it. One historian later remarked, "In Mexico, the arrival of U.S. troops so close to the Rio Grande was seen as an invasion. The Mexican government, now led by President José Joaquín de Herrera, was in a state of turmoil, pressured by hardliners and weakened by civil unrest." Herrera refused to recognize the Rio Grande border, but was hesitant to launch a full-scale war. Meanwhile, in Texas and Washington, the situation was tense. American newspapers decried Mexican intransigence. Texas politicians demanded a stronger military presence to secure their claimed border. Provocations and de-escalations in early 1846, Polk ordered General Taylor to advance south from Corpus Christi to the banks of the Rio Grande, directly across from the Mexican town of Matamoros. There, Taylor established Fort Texas, later renamed Fort Brown, in a blatant military occupation of disputed territory. Mexico responded with fury. Mexican forces under General Mariano Arista moved to confront Taylor's army. Herrera, under intense nationalist pressure, resigned. He was replaced by General Mariano Paredes, who vowed to defend Mexican honor. Mexican newspapers called for the expulsion of the Yankee invaders. The tension reached its breaking point in April 1846, when a Mexican cavalry patrol ambushed a U.S. reconnaissance unit in the disputed strip, killing or capturing over a dozen American soldiers. Polk now had the excuse he needed. On May 11, 1846, he appeared before Congress and declared, "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil." Congress responded with a declaration of war, slouching. Toward war, Polk's provocations and Mexican responses. War was not inevitable, but it was engineered. Polk's vision President James K. Polk came into office in 1845 with clear goals. Annex Texas, already in motion, acquire California and New Mexico, establish the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. He was a disciple of manifest destiny and believed that expansion by diplomacy or by force was both just and inevitable. But Mexico, still reeling from internal political instability, refused to sell any of its northern territories. Polk dispatched a secret envoy, John Slidell, to Mexico City with an offer. The U.S. would pay $25 million for California and New Mexico and recognize the Rio Grande as Texas border. Mexico refused even to receive him. Polk considered this a diplomatic insult. At the same time, he kept the army moving, instructing General Taylor to march directly into the disputed territory. The goal was to force a confrontation. Mexican political chaos. Mexico in the 1840s was deeply fragmented. Since gaining independence in 1821, the country had endured frequent coups, shifting constitutions, centralist versus federalist, military strongmen dominating politics, economic hardship, and war exhaustion. By the time Polk sent Slidell, President Herrera was clinging to power by a thread. Accepting a U.S. emissary offering to buy Mexican land was political suicide. He was soon overthrown by General Paredes, who promised to defend Mexican integrity at all costs. Mexican pride, though battered, remained fierce. No matter their internal divisions, Mexicans across the political spectrum agreed on one thing. The northern territories were not for sale. From ambush to outrage, when Taylor's men were attacked in April 1846, Polk was ready. He sent his war message to Congress carefully crafted to paint the U.S. as the victim. He omitted mention of the disputed territory. He emphasized the shedding of American blood on American soil. He insisted that diplomacy had failed because of insult. A divided Congress on May 13, 1846. Congress declared war, but not without dissent. A young Abraham Lincoln, then serving in the House, questioned the validity of Polk's claim that the attack occurred on American soil. These became known as the Spot Resolutions, in which Lincoln demanded that Polk identify the exact spot where blood was shed. Others, including Whigs like Henry Clay, saw the war as an attempt to extend slavery into new territories, but opposition was overrun by patriotic fervor, expansionist zeal, and Southern ambition. The war begins. Taylor's campaign in northern Mexico WAR begins April 1846 in the spring of 1846. A tense and explosive situation on the southern frontier of Texas erupted into open warfare between the United States and Mexico. This was not a sudden event, but the culmination of decades of competing territorial claims, imperial ambitions, and political instability. The spark that ignited the Mexican-American War came in a disputed strip of land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, volatile borderland that symbolized the broader conflict between two nations heading toward inevitable confrontation. Setting the stage, disputed borders and clashing ambitions when the United States annexed Texas in 1845. It inherited a volatile dispute with Mexico. Texas had claimed the Rio Grande as its southern boundary, while Mexico insisted that the true border was the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north. The land between the two rivers, barren and sparsely populated area known as the Nueces Strip, became the flashpoint for war. President James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist, saw the annexation of Texas as just the beginning. His administration envisioned a continental empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. To achieve this, Polk was prepared to provoke conflict. He ordered General Zachary Taylor, a seasoned and politically neutral commander, to move his troops into the disputed territory. In January 1846, Taylor established a base at Corpus Christi, near the mouth of the Nueces. In March, under orders from Washington, he advanced to the banks of the Rio Grande and began constructing a fort directly across from the Mexican city of Matamoros. Mexico viewed this as a blatant act of aggression. To them, U.S. troops had invaded sovereign Mexican land. First blood, the skirmish of April 25, the Mexican government, under increasing domestic pressure and enraged by Polk's provocations, decided to respond. On April 25, 1846, a Mexican cavalry unit crossed the Rio Grande and attacked a small U.S. patrol commanded by Captain Seth Thornton. The clash left 11 Americans dead and several others captured. President Polk seized upon the incident as a casus belli. In a message to Congress, he declared that Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. Though the legitimacy of this claim was debatable, the U.S. had arguably entered Mexican territory first. The message was effective. On May 13, 1846, Congress formally declared war on Mexico, mobilizing for war. The declaration of war unleashed a wave of patriotic fervor across the United States. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Polk issued a call for 50,000 men. Nearly 200,000 responded. The war was initially portrayed as a righteous cause to avenge American honor and extend liberty into the Western territories, but the motivations were more complex. Southern leaders saw the war as an opportunity to expand slavery into new territories, Western settlers hoped for land grants. Politicians eyed electoral advantages. And many ordinary citizens were drawn by adventure, wages, or the promise of land. Taylor's first campaign. Fortifying the Rio Grande. A General Taylor, commanding about 3,000 troops at the time of the April skirmish, quickly prepared for further hostilities. He constructed Fort Texas, later renamed Fort Brown, opposite Matamoros. As tensions escalated, Mexican forces under General Mariano Arista gathered on the southern bank of the river in early May. Arista moved to cut off Taylor's supply line. Between Fort Texas and Point Isabel, a coastal depot, Taylor responded by marching to defend his base at Point Isabel, leaving Fort Texas under the command of Major Jacob Brown. While Taylor was away, Mexican forces began bombarding Fort Texas. The siege lasted several days, during which Major Brown was killed, but the defenders held firm. Taylor, meanwhile, prepared for a counterstrike. The battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palmanon, May 8, 1846. Taylor's forces encountered Arista's army at Palo Alto, though the Americans were outnumbered. Their superior artillery, particularly the new flying artillery units, proved decisive. Taylor's forces inflicted heavy casualties and forced the Mexican army to retreat. The next day, May 9th, Taylor pursued the retreating Mexicans and engaged them again at Resaca de la Palma. This battle was fought in dense chaparral and was more chaotic and brutal than the previous day's artillery duel. After intense fighting, Taylor's men captured several Mexican artillery pieces and forced Arista to flee across the Rio Grande. These twin victories secured U.S. control of the contested area. Taylor re-entered Fort Texas, now renamed Fort Brown, in honor of the fallen major. The early successes transformed Taylor into a national hero and secured the Rio Grande as the new de facto border, at least for the time being. Political reactions and divided opinions. While war fever gripped much of the nation, there were dissenting voices. Northern Whigs, including a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, questioned Polk's justification for war. They demanded to know the exact spot on which American blood had been shed. This spot resolution became a symbol of growing anti-war sentiment among some factions. Others feared that the war would serve only to expand slavery. Former President John Quincy Adams argued that it was a war of conquest designed to extend the slaveholding interests of the South. Nevertheless, the war proceeded with broad public and political support. Taylor, now bolstered by reinforcements, prepared for a deeper invasion into northern Mexico. Legacy of the opening campaign. Initial phase of the war, from the provocation in the Nueces Strip to the victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, set the tone for the conflict that followed. It demonstrated the professionalism and mobility of the U.S. Army, the political ambition of its leaders, and the vulnerability of the Mexican military. It also highlighted the power of presidential rhetoric and media manipulation. Polk had masterfully framed the war as a defensive struggle, masking its imperial undertones. But the blood spilled in the borderlands was only the beginning. The war would soon spread across thousands of miles, from the deserts of New Mexico to the mountains of central Mexico. And as Taylor pushed deeper into enemy territory, he would find that early victories would not guarantee an easy or swift conclusion to the war. Conclusion. From skirmish to full-scale wartha clash in the Nueces Strip transformed a simmering dispute into a full-scale war. It exposed the fragility of diplomacy and the volatility of nationalism. President Polk's calculated gamble had paid off in the short term, but it would come at a heavy cost, not only in lives, but in the moral and political fabric of the nation. Zachary Taylor emerged as a national figure, a general whose battlefield success would eventually propel him to the presidency. But in the spring of 1846, he was simply the man entrusted with launching a war whose consequences would echo for decades. The war had begun. The path to California, to Mexico City, and to a transformed American continent now lay open. The war begins. Taylor's campaign in northern Mexico way. Introduction. From skirmish to invasion when President James K. Polk addressed Congress in May 1846, asserting that Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil. It marked the beginning of a full-scale war between the United States and Mexico. The small clash near the Rio Grande on April 25, 1846, provided the spark. But what followed was an ambitious and bloody campaign led by General Zachary Taylor that would test the U.S. Army's capabilities and reveal deep divides within American politics. II General Zachary Taylor, the reluctant hero known as Old Rough and Ready, General Zachary Taylor was not a polished officer in the traditional sense. He preferred comfort over ceremony, shunned the usual trappings of military pomp, and was known for his calm demeanor under pressure. Yet, in the early days of the U.S.-Mexican War, he would become the face of American military effort. Polk had chosen Taylor to lead the American force into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, a region claimed by both nations. III. The occupation of Matamoros following the clash at the Rio Grande. Taylor swiftly moved his forces to secure key Mexican positions along the border. His troops crossed into Mexican territory and occupied the city of Matamoros. By May 18, 1846, the occupation was swift and relatively bloodless. But the implications were enormous. The U.S. Army was now operating deep inside sovereign Mexican territory. Taylor established a base there to support his forthcoming campaign further into the Mexican interior. IV political tensions back home. Taylor's military success was greeted with enthusiasm in many quarters of the United States, especially among expansionists who saw the war as a chance to extend the nation from coast to coast. But not everyone agreed. Northern Whigs, including a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, began to question Polk's justification for the war. Did Mexico truly attack on American soil? Was the conflict a war of aggression disguised as defense? The march south, Camargo, and the gathering storm. Taylor used Matamoros as a staging ground for a deeper incursion. He moved southward to Camargo, where he gathered more troops and supplies for a full invasion. This logistical buildup was crucial. The harsh environment, scorching heat, disease, and limited supply lines posed constant threats. Nevertheless, Taylor pressed on, determined to strike at the heart of northern Mexico. Battle of Monterrey. September 1846, Taylor's next major target was the fortified city of Monterrey. The Battle of Monterrey, fought from September 21st to 24th, was a brutal urban engagement. Mexican forces under General Pedro de Ampudia defended the city fiercely. American troops fought street by street, house by house, facing sniper fire and artillery in a chaotic environment. It was one of the first examples of modern urban warfare in American military history. After several days of combat, Mexican forces agreed to surrender the city under generous terms negotiated by Taylor. His decision to allow Mexican troops to withdraw with their arms and honor intact would earn him criticism in Washington, where Polk feared Taylor was becoming too independent and too popular. Taylor's strategy and Polk's suspicion. Despite his victories, Taylor's autonomy worried the Polk administration. The president, a Democrat, viewed Taylor a potential Whig political rival, with suspicion. There was a growing belief in Washington that Taylor's victories might make him a presidential contender. As a result, Polk began diverting troops and resources to a new campaign under General Winfield Scott aimed at Mexico City, effectively sidelining Taylor from the war's final phase. 8th, morale and misery. The soldiers' experience. For the average American soldier, the campaign in northern Mexico was grueling. Disease claimed more lives than combat. Dysentery, yellow fever, and heat stroke plagued the camps. Letters home described the suffering and questioned the purpose of the war. Desertion rates were high, yet many soldiers were motivated by the promise of land, pay, and glory the tangible. Spoils of manifest destiny. Icast Mexican resistance and fractures Mexican. Forces in the north were under-equipped and often poorly led. Nonetheless, they mounted stiff resistance. The loss of Monterrey was a severe blow to Mexican morale, and many questioned the leadership in Mexico City. The internal divisions within Mexico between centralists and federalists, liberals and conservatives weakened the national war effort. Conclusion. A hero rises. A war expands. By late 1846, General Zachary Taylor had emerged as a national hero. His victories in northern Mexico energized the U.S. war effort and made the dream of territorial expansion seem within reach. But his success came at a cost. The war was escalating, the casualties were mounting, and political tensions in both Mexico and the United States were deepening. Taylor's campaign had set the stage for the next, more ambitious phase of the conflict, General Scott's march on Mexico City, but it had also cemented his place in the American imagination. A soldier of simple means, leading men through dust and blood. He represented both the promise and peril of America's manifest destiny. Taylor's march south, the first major clashes after war, was officially declared on May 13, 1846. General Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, led the main U.S. force into northern Mexico. But even before war was declared, Taylor's army was already engaged in combat. The two pivotal early battles, Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, would shape the course of the war and dramatically shift American public opinion. Prelude to battle, the Fort Texas siege in March 1846. Taylor had established Fort Texas, later renamed Fort Brown, just across the Rio Grande from the Mexican town of Matamoros. This was deep within the disputed Nueces Strip, territory claimed by both nations. His bold move was viewed by Mexico as an invasion. In response, Mexican General Mariano Arista ordered artillery strikes and laid siege to Fort Texas on May 3, 1846. Inside the fort, U.S. forces under Major Jacob Brown endured constant bombardment. Taylor, stationed at Point Isabel for supply operations, was forced to act. Taylor's march to relieve the fort with Fort Texas under siege. Taylor set out with approximately 2,300 troops on May 7 from Point Isabel, determined to relieve the fort and challenge Arista's growing Mexican force, which numbered around 3,700 men. The Texas prairie, flat, grassy, and treeless would soon become the site of the first major clashes of the war. May 8, 1846, Battle of Palo Alto location, 5 miles north of Brownsville. Texas U.S. forces, approximately 2,300 troops. Mexican forces, approximately 3,700 troops. The two armies collided on May 8 in the open plains of Palo Alto, where U.S. artillery proved decisive. Taylor, realizing he was outnumbered, relied heavily on flying artillery mobile, rapid-firing cannons that could be repositioned on the battlefield, led by Major Samuel Ringgold. These artillery units unleashed devastating fire on the Mexican lines. The Mexican army, formed in traditional linear formations, was shredded by American cannon fire. Arista attempted cavalry charges, but U.S. artillery broke them before they reached their target. By sunset, the Mexican army withdrew. Though not a complete rout, it was a clear American victory. Casualties: U.S. 9 dead, 47 wounded. Mexico, approximately 100 dead, 400 wounded. This was a stunning reversal and outnumbered U.S. force had dealt a serious blow to Mexico's northern army. May 9, 1846, Battle of Resaca de la Palma location, near a ravine. Resaca, south of Palo Alto. U.S. forces, 1,700 troops. Mexican forces, approximately 4,000 troops, the next day, Taylor pursued the retreating Mexican army to a dense, forested ravine called Resaca de la Palma. The terrain here was the opposite of Palo Alto. Thick brush and gullies made visibility and coordination difficult. Still, Taylor launched a bold frontal assault. U.S. infantry fought hand-to-hand with East Mexican troops hidden in the dense foliage. At the climax of the battle, U.S. Captain Charles May led a daring cavalry charge that captured Mexican artillery and nearly captured Arista himself. Eventually, Mexican forces panicked and fled across the Rio Grande, abandoning equipment and artillery. Many drowned trying to cross. Casualties: U.S. 33 dead, 89 wounded, Mexico 160+ dead, 200 wounded. Hundreds captured. It was a crushing Mexican defeat. Taylor had not only saved Fort Texas, but also dealt Mexico a humiliating loss on what was now officially a battlefield of war. The aftermath: a hero emerges with these twin victories. Zachary Taylor emerged as a national hero. Newspapers across the United States celebrated his grit, bravery, and modesty. His popularity soared, and his battlefield reputation would eventually carry him to the White House. The Mexican army, meanwhile, suffered not just military defeat, but national embarrassment. Supplies, weapons, and troops were lost in droves. The morale of Arista's men was shattered. Arista himself was blamed for the defeats and relieved of command shortly after. Political shockwaves posed the victories. To galvanize support for the war, which remained controversial in many northern states. While Whigs and anti-expansionists worried about Polk's imperial motives, the twin battles gave him political ammunition to justify the invasion. American valor has triumphed, Polk proclaimed, even as Congress debated the ethics of invading a neighbor. Strategic importance: Taylor's success secured the Rio Grande as the first major front of the war. But Polk had much bigger ambitions: California, New Mexico, and Mexico City itself. But Taylor, now commanding the U.S. Army of Occupation, would soon begin pushing deeper into northern Mexico. Southward advance, the occupation of Monterrey, and the brutality of urban combat. Summer-fall, 1846, America versus Mexico, 1846-1848. The war that changed the border. The road to Monterrey. The victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma in May 1846. General Zachary Taylor found himself a national hero and the head of a growing army. Reinforcements poured in from across the U.S. regulars and volunteers alike, swelling his forces to over 6,000 by midsummer. As the blistering heat of the Rio Grande Valley bore down, Taylor set his eyes on a major strategic prize: Monterrey, located in northern Mexico. The city of Monterrey was the capital of Nuevo León and a critical supply and communication hub for the Mexican military. It was also a natural defensive stronghold, Q2 nestled among jagged mountains with fortifications, stone buildings, and winding alleys perfect for urban defense. Taylor's orders were to move south and occupy the city, an action that would further cripple Mexico's northern frontier and bolster U.S. leverage at the negotiating table. But what awaited him there would be unlike anything the American army had encountered thus far. 2. General Amputia's last stand. In response to Taylor's advance, Mexican General Pedro de Ampudia was ordered to defend Monterrey at all costs. Though President Santa Anna would later replace him at this moment, Ampudia was determined to resist American forces despite his precarious supply situation and a demoralized army. By September, Ampudia had assembled roughly 7,000 defenders, soldiers, irregulars, and local militia, and had fortified the city. Rooftops were reinforced for snipers. Artillery was placed on key hills surrounding the city, most notably at Fort Tenerilla and the Bishop's Palace Palacio del Obispado, which overlooked the western approach. Trenches and barricades were dug through major streets. Women and children were evacuated. And a siege mentality took hold. Amputia's message to his troops was clear. Monterrey would be defended to the last man. 3. Taylor's march and battle plans. Taylor, cautious but resolute, moved south in early September. By the 18th, he reached the outskirts of Monterrey with approximately 6,200 men and a small battery of artillery. His force was a mix of regular U.S. Army troops, volunteer units from Texas, Mississippi, and Kentucky, and engineers tasked with mapping and reconnaissance. Taylor knew he faced a difficult choice. Monterrey was no open field, was an entrenched, walled urban center with defenders in nearly every building. Street fighting would be brutal. But bypassing the city risked allowing a large Mexican force to remain active behind U.S. lines. His plan called for a two-pronged attack. General William Worth would lead a flanking maneuver around the city to the west, targeting the Bishop's Palace. Taylor himself, with Generals Twiggs and Butler, would engage from the east and northeast, drawing attention and splitting Mexican defenses. IV. The Siege of Monterrey begins. September 20th to 21st. On September 20th, 1846, the American Army began its approach. Worth's column, consisting of elite troops and light artillery, maneuvered around the city and ascended the rugged terrain west of Monterrey. By the next day, they began bombarding Mexican positions atop the hills surrounding the Bishop's Palace. Meanwhile, Taylor's main force faced entrenched Mexican troops defending the northeastern sector. The Americans quickly found that fighting block by block, house by house, was an entirely different kind of war. Mexican snipers fired from rooftops and windows. Streets were choked with barricades. Cannon fire echoed off stone walls. Death came from above, around corners, and through shattered windows. Urban warfare had arrived in full. The carnage of urban combat. What followed was a nightmare. The Americans, untrained for urban assault, suffered heavily. Every advance was met with withering musket fire and grape shot from hidden batteries. Mexican soldiers fired from loopholes in thick adobe walls and retreated through back alleys, turning each courtyard and building into a miniature fortress. Taylor's troops responded by adapting on the fly. Instead of advancing down streets' death traps, they began blasting holes through walls. Moving from building to building under cover, axes and bayonets became as valuable as bullets. Engineers rigged ladders for rooftop assaults. Casualties mounted rapidly. One Texas volunteer described Monterrey as a city of shadows and smoke, where death waited behind every door. The fiercest fighting came at Fort Teneria, a major bastion on the eastern side. The Americans charged it multiple times over 2 days, suffering grievous losses. Finally, they stormed the ramparts and took it, driving the defenders back toward the city center. Vi. Worth's flank, the turning point while Taylor struggled in the northeast. General Worth's western assault turned the tide. After capturing the outer defenses, Worth's forces advanced toward the Bishop's Palace on September 23rd. The palace, perched atop a hill, controlled much of the city. In a daring pre-dawn attack, Worth's men scaled the heights under artillery cover and seized the stronghold. The capture of the Bishop's Palace allowed American forces to position cannon that raked the city below, shattering morale among Mexican defenders. With the palace lost, Monterrey was surrounded. The noose tightened. White flag and controversy. September 24th. On September 24th, General Ampudia requested a parley. After days of bloodshed, his forces were depleted, outgunned, and demoralized. Taylor, though victorious, had also taken significant losses, nearly 500 casualties, including many officers. Rather than demand unconditional surrender, Taylor agreed to an 8-week armistice. Mexican troops would be allowed to withdraw south, keeping their arms, and the U.S. would occupy Monterrey. This decision sparked outrage in Washington, especially among expansionist politicians and Polk himself. Many saw it as a missed opportunity to destroy a major Mexican army. But Taylor, citing logistical concerns and humanitarian reasons, refused to press the attack. It was a soldier's decision, not a politician's. 8. The aftermath and moral weight. The occupation of Monterrey marked a significant turning point in the war. For the first time, the U.S. military had captured a major Mexican city through sustained urban combat. Yet, it came at a steep price. For Mexican civilians, the occupation brought hardship, confiscation of supplies, and the constant presence of foreign troops. Although Taylor tried to maintain order and discipline among his men, incidents of looting, harassment, and violence occurred. The city itself was left physically and emotionally scarred. Walls bore bullet holes and blast marks. Churches served as hospitals. Families mourned in silence. For the U.S., Monterrey proved that the war would not be easy or cheap. Casualties had shaken volunteer units. Disease spread through the army. The urban slaughter haunted many soldiers, changing their romantic visions of war into something much darker. Strategic implications, despite the armistice. The occupation of Monterrey solidified U.S. control over northeastern Mexico. It became a major base of operations for the next phase of the war. It also made Taylor more politically dangerous. His popularity surged, earning him the nickname Old Rough and Ready. President Polk, suspicious of Taylor's rising fame, began shifting focus to General Winfield Scott, who would soon embark on the central campaign to Mexico City. But for the soldiers who fought in Monterrey, the battle had already left its mark. It had shown the world that the U.S. was willing and able to wage modern, brutal war in a foreign land. Legacy, the Battle of Monterrey stands today as one of the most intense and formative engagements of the Mexican-American War. It revealed the evolving nature of warfare, the limits of political leadership, and the complexities of conquering foreign cities. It was a preview of the challenges yet to come in the heartland of Mexico. And it was a moment when both nations stared into the abyss of protracted conflict and marched forward anyway. Politics and personalities. Taylor versus Scott and the strategic debate. Two generals, two visions. General Zachary Taylor, Old, Rough, and Ready, was straightforward, direct, and beloved by his men. A career soldier with no visible political ambition, he favored careful advances and steady consolidation in northern Mexico. His victories at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey showcased tactical prowess and tenacity. General Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers, was the Army's senior officer with expansive strategic vision. Capture Veracruz and march inland to Mexico City. He was analytically minded, always planning logistics and long-term campaigns, but politically fraught with deep distrust from President Polk I. Polk's political chessboard. President James K. Polk did not trust either general. Both were aligned with the Whig Party. Reluctantly, he appointed Scott to oversee the main invasion, but initially retained Taylor in the north to avoid giving either general prestige too early. As Taylor's victories mounted, Polk realized that Taylor might become a political threat. Scott, too, had presidential ambitions. The president maneuvered to ensure both remained constrained by strategic decisions and rivalry. Strategic disagreements. Taylor preferred consolidation. Secure northern Mexico, fortify the Rio Grande border, and avoid overextension. He saw Santa Anna's forces as capable and better defended nearer the capital. Scott argued for audacity, land at Veracruz, endure logistical challenges, and strike at Mexico City directly. It was a risky but bold strategy with broader political aims. Amid tensions on the ground, Taylor signed an armistice in Monterrey, September 1846. allowing Mexican troops to withdraw honorably, a decision that outraged Polk and Scott because it missed the opportunity for decisive annihilation of enemy forces. Taylor also disobeyed orders by expanding his campaign south to Saltillo and Buena Vista, even as Polk transferred units to Scott's command. His independent actions increased friction and suspicion from the administration v. Cabinet intrigue and partisan patronage. Polk's cabinet debated war aims and strategy, wary of giving either general the hero's mantle. Secretary of War William Marcy and Secretary of State James Buchanan argued that both Scott and Taylor could challenge Democratic dominance in 1848. Political patronage became rife. Volunteer commissions and command posts were awarded based on partisan loyalty. Polk's office even used Democratic informants to undermine Taylor and Scott among the ranks v. Military culture and leadership style. Informal, practical, honored by the enlisted men. Ulysses S. Grant later praised his calm leadership and plain orders. Taylor dressed like a private, led by example, and avoided political posturing. Scott, formal, perfectionist, doctrinaire. He insisted on dignity, discipline, and staff work traits that earned respect but also sparked resentment among commanders accustomed to more flexible tactics. VI. The turning point. Scott takes the field by late 1846. Polk restructured the war effort. Scott assumed command of amphibious landings at Veracruz, while Taylor was ordered to hold position near Monterrey and Saltillo. This cleared the path for the primary thrust toward Mexico City while sidestepping Taylor's growing influence. Scott's success would come at a cost. Partisan generals like Gideon Pillow, favored by Polk, clashed with Scott. When Polk adopted Pillow's claims over Scott's merits, Scott's political star faded even as he captured key terrain on the road to Mexico City. VII. Broader implications. The Taylor versus Scott rivalry mirrored the U.S. political divide, sectional tensions, party power plays, and the role of military heroism in shaping national politics. Both generals would influence future American leadership. Taylor won the presidency in 1848 largely on his war record. Scott's doctrines and staff systems shaped leaders like Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. During the Civil War conclusion, the strategic debate between Taylor and Scott shows more than military divergence. It exposes the deep interplay of politics, ambition, and war. Their competing styles and preferences forced Polk to juggle battlefield decisions carefully, ultimately redirecting the war toward its southern and central campaigns under Scott. The rivalry set the stage for the U.S. conquest of Mexico City, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in American civil-military relations, leadership models, and partisan politics. Politics and personalities. Taylor versus Scott and the strategic debate. Two generals, two visions. General Zachary Taylor, old, rough, and ready, was straightforward, direct, and beloved by his men. A career soldier with no visible political ambition, he favored careful advances and steady consolidation in northern Mexico. His victories at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Monterrey showcased tactical prowess and tenacity. General Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, was the Army's senior officer with expansive strategic vision. Capture Veracruz and march inland to Mexico City. He was analytically minded, always planning logistics and long-term campaigns, but politically fraught with deep distrust from President Polk I. Polk's political chessboard. President James K. Polk did not trust either general. Both were aligned with the Whig Party. Reluctantly, he appointed Scott to oversee the main invasion, but initially retained Taylor in the north to avoid giving either general prestige too early. As Taylor's victories mounted, Polk realized that Taylor might become a political threat. Scott, too, had presidential ambitions. The president maneuvered to ensure both remained constrained by strategic decisions and rivalry. CI. Strategic disagreements. Taylor preferred consolidation. Secure northern Mexico. Fortify the Rio Grande border and avoid overextension. He saw Santa Anna's forces as capable and better defended nearer the capital. Scott argued for audacity. Land. At Veracruz, endure logistical challenges and strike at Mexico City directly. It was a risky but bold strategy with broader political aims. Amid tensions on the ground, Taylor signed an armistice in Monterrey, September 1846. Allowing Mexican troops to withdraw honorably, a decision that outraged Polk and Scott because it missed the opportunity for decisive annihilation of enemy forces. Taylor also disobeyed orders by expanding his campaign south to Saltillo and Buena Vista, even as Polk transferred units to Scott's command. His independent actions increased friction and suspicion from the administration v. Cabinet intrigue and partisan patronage. Polk's cabinet debated war aims and strategy, wary of giving either general the hero's mantle. Secretary of War William Marcy and Secretary of State James Buchanan argued that both Scott and Taylor could challenge Democratic dominance in 1848. Political patronage became rife. Volunteer commissions and command posts were awarded based on partisan loyalty. Polk's office even used Democratic informants to undermine Taylor and Scott among the ranks. v. Military culture and leadership style. Informal, practical, honored by the enlisted men. Ulysses S. Grant later praised his calm leadership and plain orders. Taylor dressed like a private, led by example, and avoided political posturing. Scott, formal, perfectionist, doctrinaire. He insisted on dignity, discipline, and staff work traits that earned respect but also sparked resentment among commanders accustomed to more flexible tactics. VI. The turning point. Scott takes the field by late 1846. Polk restructured the war effort. Scott assumed command of amphibious landings at Veracruz, while Taylor was ordered to hold position near Monterrey and Saltillo. This cleared the path for the primary thrust toward Mexico City while sidestepping Taylor's growing influence. Scott's success would come at a cost. Partisan generals like Gideon Pillow, favored by Polk, clashed with Scott. When Polk adopted Pillow's claims over Scott's merits, Scott's political star faded even as he captured key terrain on the road to Mexico City. VII. Broader implications. The Taylor versus Scott rivalry mirrored the U.S. political divide, sectional tensions, party power plays, and the role of military heroism in shaping national politics. Both generals would influence future American leadership. Taylor won the presidency in 1848 largely on his war record. Scott's doctrines and staff systems shaped leaders like Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. During the Civil War conclusion, the strategic debate between Taylor and Scott shows more than military divergence. It exposes the deep interplay of politics, ambition, and war. Their competing styles and preferences forced Polk to juggle battlefield decisions carefully, ultimately redirecting the war toward its southern and central campaigns under Scott. The rivalry set the stage for the U.S. conquest of Mexico City, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in American civil-military relations, leadership models, and partisan politics.